Welcome to Inside the Funeral of Tutankhamun, a journey over 3,300 years into the heart of ancient Egypt's most mysterious farewell. Imagine the year, 1323, before the Common Era. The Valley of the Kings bathed in torchlight, priests chanting hymns to Osiris, and golden treasures shimmering beneath layers of linen. The young pharaoh Tutankhamun, who ruled for barely a decade, is about to embark on his eternal voyage. In this video, we open the gates to the House of Eternity, exploring the sacred rituals, the perfumed oils, and the spells from the Book of the Dead whispered into the desert night. You'll witness how Egypt's artisans and priests transformed a boy king's death into one of history's most awe-inspiring spectacles, a ceremony not just of mourning, but of divine rebirth. Prepare to step inside the tomb, where silence and gold tell the story of Egypt's timeless quest for immortality. Somewhere around the year 1341, before the Common Era, in the royal palaces of ancient Egypt, most likely in the newly constructed city of Akhetaten, modern day, el-Amarna, a remote stretch of desert, on the east bank of the Nile, in Middle Egypt, a boy was born into a dynasty, tearing itself apart. His father was almost certainly Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, who had upended centuries of Egyptian religious tradition by abolishing the worship of the old gods and replacing them with devotion to a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk. DNA analysis conducted in 2010 by Egyptian geneticist Zahi Hawass and his team confirmed that the mummy, known as KV55, widely believed to be Akhenaten, was indeed Tutankhamun's biological father, and that his mother was one of Akhenaten's own sisters, a woman whose mummy is catalogued simply as the younger lady from tomb KV35. This means Tutankhamun was the product of a brother-sister union, a fact that would have devastating consequences for his health. Akhenaten's religious revolution was not a gentle reform. It was a violent upheaval. Temples to Amun, Ra, Ptah, and the other traditional gods were physically closed. In some cases, the names and images of the old gods were chiseled off temple walls and monuments across the entire country. An act of theological erasure that the Egyptian people considered not just offensive, but genuinely dangerous, as it threatened the cosmic order that held the world together. The powerful clergy of Amun at Karnak, once the most influential religious institution in Egypt and controllers of vast agricultural estates and treasury reserves, was stripped of its wealth and authority virtually overnight. Akhenaten even abandoned the ancient capital of Thebes, the city the Egyptians called Waset, home of the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, and built an entirely new city in the desert, Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, as a monument to his radical vision. At its peak, this city housed perhaps 30,000 people, with palaces, temples open to the sky, and broad ceremonial roads. But revolutions, especially unpopular ones, rarely survive the death of the revolutionary. And when Akhenaten died, after 17 years on the throne, the kingdom he left behind was fractured, unstable, and desperate for restoration. Egypt's foreign influence had waned. Diplomatic relationships documented in the famous el-Amarna letters, clay tablets found at the site in 1887, reveal increasingly desperate pleas from vassal states begging for military help. That never came. The empire was eroding from within and without. Into that chaos stepped a child. Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, a name that itself reflected his father's religious obsession, ascended to the throne when he was approximately 9 or 10 years old, inheriting a nation in crisis. One of the first and most symbolically charged acts of his reign was the changing of his own name. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, a public declaration that the old gods were back and the Aten heresy was over. He was married to Akhetaten, likely his half-sister, who had similarly changed her name from Akhetaten, she too shedding the Aten from her identity. Their marriage, as was customary among Egyptian royalty, was meant to preserve the divine bloodline and legitimize the young king's claim. Tragically, evidence of their personal life together includes two tiny mummified fetuses found in Tutankhamun's tomb, stillborn daughters, one at approximately 5 months of gestation and the other at 7 to 9 months. DNA analysis confirmed both were the children of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, and the genetic defects, likely resulting from the consanguineous marriage, may have contributed to the pregnancy's failure. A boy of 9, however, does not rule alone. Powerful advisors surrounded him, men like the vizier I, who held the unusual title God's Father and may have been the father of Nefertiti herself, and the military commander Horemheb, a non-royal general of formidable ambition who controlled Egypt's army. These men guided the young king's decisions, shaped his policies, and almost certainly used him as an instrument to undo his father's legacy. Under Tutankhamun's name, the old gods were restored. The temples of Amun were reopened and lavishly refurbished. The abandoned capital of Akhetaten was left to crumble in the desert, its buildings eventually dismantled for stone, its memory deliberately erased. The court returned to Thebes and to Memphis, the traditional administrative capital in the north. A great restoration stela was erected at Karnak, its text declaring that when the young king came to power, the temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine to the marshes of the delta had fallen into ruin, their shrines desolate and overgrown with weeds. The gods had turned their backs on this land. The stela proclaimed that Tutankhamun had healed the damage, restored the priesthoods, and rebuilt the temples with gold, silver, and precious stones. Whether Tutankhamun truly understood the political weight of these decisions or was merely a puppet of older, more ambitious men remains one of the great unanswered questions of Egyptology. The historian Joyce Tildesley has noted that Tutankhamun's reign was effectively managed by committee, a diplomatic way of saying the boy king may have had very little real power at all. What is certain is that his reign was short. For roughly 9 years, Tutankhamun sat on the throne of Egypt, and then, around the age of 19, he was dead. The circumstances of his death have been debated for over a century. Was he murdered? That was the dramatic theory proposed after an early X-ray study in 1968 by Ronald Harrison of the University of Liverpool revealed bone fragments inside the skull, leading to speculation about a fatal blow to the head. Was he weakened by genetic disease, the product of generations of royal inbreeding that left him with a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and Kola disease? Did he fall from a chariot during a hunt, a pastime depicted on objects found in his tomb, including decorated chest panels showing the king riding into battle? Whatever the cause, his death was sudden and unexpected, so sudden, in fact, that no proper royal tomb had been completed for him. And it triggered one of the most elaborate royal funerals in the history of ancient Egypt, a funeral that would remain sealed, undiscovered, and perfectly preserved for over 3,000 years. The moment a pharaoh died, a sacred clock began to tick. Egyptian religious tradition demanded a mummification process lasting approximately 70 days, a period carefully calibrated to mirror the cycle of the star Sirius called Sopdet, by the Egyptians disappearing from and returning to the night sky. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 before the Common Era, provided one of the earliest outsider accounts of the embalming process, describing 3 tiers of service available depending on the wealth of the deceased. For a pharaoh, naturally, only the most elaborate method would suffice. Every step of this process was governed by ritual, prayer, and profound symbolic meaning, overseen by priests who served as intermediaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The chief embalmer wore the mask of a jackal, embodying the role of divine guardian of the dead, and was assisted by a team that ancient texts refer to as the bandagers and sealers. The first and most dramatic step was the removal of the internal organs. The embalmers, working in a sacred tent known as the Ibu, or place of purification, typically set up on the west bank of the Nile near the necropolis, began by extracting the brain. A long, hooked bronze instrument was inserted through the left nostril, and the brain was carefully broken up and pulled out in fragments. The Egyptians considered it a largely useless organ, merely the producer of mucus, unworthy of preservation. Herodotus himself described this procedure, noting that a portion of the brain was also dissolved using injected fluids and drained out. The heart, however, was left in place, for it was believed to be the seat of intelligence, memory, and the soul, the organ that would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Two Truths during the judgment of the dead. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul could pass into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. If it was heavier, it would be devoured by Amit, the terrifying chimera with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were removed through an incision in the left side of the abdomen, made with a sharp Ethiopian stone obsidian, according to Herodotus, who also reported the curious detail that the man who made this incision was ritually chased away and pelted with stones afterward, as if the necessary violation of the body was itself a kind of sin that had to be symbolically punished. Each organ was treated separately, dried, anointed with sacred oils and perfumed resins, and placed inside beautifully crafted canopic jars. In Tutankhamun's case, these jars were masterpieces of art carved from translucent calcite alabaster, topped with portrait lids bearing the young king's serene likeness, and housed within an exquisitely gilded wooden canopic chest guarded by 4 golden goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, their arms outstretched in protection. Each jar was symbolically guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti protected the liver, Hapi guarded the lungs, Duamutef watched over the stomach, and Kubesnuef kept the intestines safe. Once the organs were removed, the body was packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt composed of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, harvested from the dry lake beds of Wadi Natrun in the western desert, about 60 miles northwest of modern Cairo. This site was so closely associated with the purification process that its very name gave us the word natron. For approximately 40 days, the natron drew every trace of moisture from the flesh. The body shrank dramatically, losing roughly 75% of its weight. The skin darkened and tightened against the bones, becoming leathery and dry. It was a slow, patient transformation, the deliberate reduction of a human being to something that could endure for millennia. During this waiting period, the craftsmen and artisans were far from idle. Workshops across Thebes would have been operating at full capacity, producing the coffins, shrines, furniture, and ritual objects needed for the burial. Given the evidence that Tutankhamun's death was unexpected, many scholars believe that some of the objects placed in his tomb were actually repurposed from other burials. Certain items bear signs of altered cartouches, names hastily recarved, suggesting a frantic scramble to assemble a king's worth of grave goods in a desperately limited time frame. After the drying was complete, the wrapping began. This was not a simple act of binding cloth around a body. It was a deeply sacred ritual lasting approximately 15 days, accompanied by continuous prayers, incantations, and readings from funerary texts, with each layer of linen corresponding to specific protective spells. The linen itself was of the finest quality in some royal burials. The total length of wrapping bandages exceeded several hundred meters. Between the layers, the priests inserted over 143 amulets in Tutankhamun's case, small carved objects made of gold, precious stones, faience, and glass, each carrying specific protective power and placed at precise locations on the body, according to instructions laid out in the Book of the Dead. Scarabs, inscribed with spells from chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead, were placed over the heart to prevent it from testifying against its owner during judgment. The Djed pillar, representing the backbone of Osiris, ensured stability and resurrection. The Tet knot, known as the blood of Isis, offered the goddess's protection. The Wedjat, the eye of Horus, warded off evil and restored wholeness. Warm tree resin was poured generously between the layers, sealing the wrappings into a rigid, darkened shell. In Tutankhamun's case, the embalmers were perhaps too generous with the resin when Howard Carter attempted to remove the mummy from its coffin in 1925. He found that the resins had hardened into a rock-like substance that had essentially glued the mummy to the coffin's interior. The team ultimately had to chisel the mummy free, causing significant damage in the process, a fact that has haunted conservators ever since. And then came the crowning act of the entire mummification, the placement of the golden death mask over the face of the mummy. In Tutankhamun's case, this mask, weighing approximately 11 kilograms of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli imported from the mountains of Badakhshan in distant Afghanistan, carnelian from the eastern desert, obsidian, quartz, and turquoise from the Sinai Peninsula, would become the most recognizable artifact in the history of archaeology. Its striped Nemes headdress, its cobra and vulture on the brow representing Upper and Lower Egypt, its calm and idealized youthful features, all of it crafted with breathtaking precision. But in that moment, in that dimly lit embalming chamber over 3,000 years ago, it served a single sacred purpose: to give the dead king an imperishable face, to transform him into a being resembling the gods themselves, an eternal figure of gold, ready for rebirth. An inscription on the shoulders of the mask, taken from the Book of the Dead, reads, "Thy right eye is the night bark of the sun god. Thy left eye is the day bark. Thy eyebrows are the Ennead of the gods. Thy forehead is Anubis. The nape of thy neck is Horus. Thy locks of hair are Ptah-Soka." Every feature of the mask was itself divine. When the 70 days were complete and the mummy lay in its nested coffins, the funeral procession began. It was a spectacle, unlike anything the common people of Thebes would have witnessed in their ordinary lives. And ancient Thebes was a city accustomed to spectacle, with its towering pylons at Karnak, its grand avenue of sphinxes, and its annual Opet festival in which the gods themselves were paraded through the streets. The mummy of Tutankhamun, sealed within its coffins and placed inside a gilded wooden shrine mounted on a sled, was dragged across the sandy ground by the highest-ranking officials of the court, likely including Ai and Horemheb themselves. Oxen may have assisted tomb paintings from other New Kingdom burials show teams of cattle pulling the funeral sled. The procession crossed the Nile from the east bank, the land of the living, where the sun rose each morning, to the west bank, where the sun set each evening and the dead were believed to enter the Duat, the underworld. The crossing itself was laden with symbolism. It was the pharaoh's final journey, mirroring the daily voyage of the sun god through the sky and into the darkness below the earth. Soldiers marched in formation. Priests in white linen robes chanted sacred hymns and burned incense, kaifi, the sacred Egyptian incense, made from wine, honey, raisins, myrrh, juniper, and other aromatics. Professional mourning women, known as the Jerit, wailed and threw dust into their unbound hair, beat their exposed chests, and let tears stream openly down their faces. Their grief was performative and essential, for it was believed that the intensity of mourning could aid the soul's passage. Tomb paintings from the period show these women in vivid blue dresses, their arms raised in lamentation, and their presence is documented in the burial records of numerous New Kingdom officials. Servants carried the vast collection of grave goods that would accompany the king into the afterlife: furniture, food, weapons, clothing, jewelry, ritual figurines, everything a king might need in the world beyond death. At the entrance to the tomb, carved into the pale limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, beneath a sky bleached white by the desert sun, the most important ritual of the entire funeral took place: the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was an ancient rite, attested as far back as the Old Kingdom, over 1,000 years before Tutankhamun's time, and it was believed to be absolutely essential for the survival of the soul. A priest, dressed in a leopard skin, the traditional garment of the Sem priest, touched the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy with a series of ritual implements: adzes of meteoric iron, Pezeshkef blades, originally designed for cutting umbilical cords, linking death symbolically to birth and serpent-headed instruments. With each touch, accompanied by specific incantations, the senses of the dead king were symbolically restored. He could see again. He could hear the prayers of the living. He could breathe the sweet air of incense. He could speak the sacred words needed to navigate the underworld. He could eat the food offerings left in his tomb. The ancient funerary texts describe the transformation vividly. Your mouth is opened by Horus with his little finger, with which he opened the mouth of his father, with which he opened the mouth of Osiris. Without this ceremony, the Egyptians believed the Ka, the life force, and the Ba, the personality or soul, would remain trapped, and the deceased would be condemned to an eternity of blind, mute, helpless non-existence. In Tutankhamun's case, the figure depicted performing this ceremony on the north wall of the burial chamber is I, his elderly advisor, shown wearing the distinctive blue Kepresh crown of a pharaoh, despite the fact that Tutankhamun had not yet been buried when the painting was made. It is a scene loaded with political tension that has fascinated historians for decades. The act of performing the opening of the mouth for a dead king was traditionally the duty and the privilege of the royal heir and successor. By placing himself in this role and by depicting himself already wearing the royal crown, I was visually and symbolically declaring himself Tutankhamun's legitimate successor before the tomb was even sealed. Within days of the funeral, I would indeed claim the throne, ruling for approximately 4 years before his own death. The question that has haunted historians ever since is pointed: had the old advisor been positioning himself for this moment all along? And what became of Akhetaten, the young queen, who may have desperately tried to prevent I's ascension? A remarkable clay tablet found in the Hittite archives at Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey, preserves a letter from an Egyptian queen, almost certainly Akhetaten, writing to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, begging him to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh. My husband has died, and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. Suppiluliuma, suspicious of such an unprecedented request, eventually sent his son Zananza, who was murdered at the Egyptian border, almost certainly on the orders of either I or Horemheb. Ankhesenamun vanishes from the historical record entirely after I's coronation. Her fate remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the 18th dynasty. The tomb itself, designated KV62 by modern archaeologists, the 62nd tomb discovered in the Valley of the Kings, Biban el-Muluk in Arabic, lies cut into the bedrock of the valley floor on the west bank of the Nile, near ancient Thebes, in what is today the city of Luxor. The Valley of the Kings served as the royal burial ground for nearly 500 years, from approximately 1539 to 1075, before the Common Era, and contains at least 63 known tombs. KV62 is remarkably small by royal standards, only 4 chambers covering approximately 110 square meters, compared to the sprawling, corridor-filled tombs of later pharaohs like Ramesses II, KV7, or Seti I, KV17, whose tombs extend over 100 meters into the mountain with dozens of decorated chambers. This modest size has led many scholars, including Carter himself, to believe it was never intended for a pharaoh at all, but was originally a private tomb, possibly for I himself, that was hastily repurposed when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, and his own intended tomb, likely KV 23, which I would later take for himself, was far from complete. Only the burial chamber walls were painted, and the paintings show signs of haste, spots of mold that developed on the wet plaster before the tomb was sealed, indicating the paint had not fully dried. When the doors were shut, a poignant detail suggesting the burial was rushed. But what the tomb lacked in size, it made up for in the staggering density of what was placed inside it. The burial chamber was almost entirely filled by 4 massive wooden shrines, each one nested inside the next like enormous rectangular Russian dolls, covered in gold leaf and inscribed with protective texts and images from the Amduat and the Book of the Dead. The outermost shrine measured approximately 5 8/100 meters long, 3 28/100 meters wide, and 2 75/100 meters tall, so large that it barely fit inside the chamber, with only a few centimeters of clearance from the walls. Carter's team would later spend 84 days dismantling these shrines alone, each panel weighing hundreds of kilograms. Within the innermost shrine sat a quartzite sarcophagus with a red granite lid, and within that lay 3 anthropoid coffins, also nested one inside the other. The outermost coffin was made of gilded cypress wood, 2 24/100 meters long. The second coffin was similarly gilded, lavishly decorated with inlays of colored glass in a rishi or feathered pattern. But the innermost coffin was something altogether extraordinary. Quote, a solid gold shell weighing approximately 110 kilograms, roughly 243 pounds of beaten gold, between 2½ and 3½ millimeters thick, crafted to hold the mummy of the king in an eternal golden embrace. Its estimated gold value today would exceed $6 million at bullion prices, but its cultural and historical value is, of course, incalculable. And resting over the face of that mummy, of course, was the golden mask, layer after layer of gold, sealing a teenage king for eternity. When Carter first lifted the lid of the outermost coffin on October 28, 1925, and saw the golden face staring up at him, he later wrote in his journal, "The sight was one that I shall never forget. A golden effigy of the young boy king, of most magnificent workmanship, filled the whole of the interior of the sarcophagus. Surrounding the coffins and shrines, crammed into every available space in the antechamber, annex, treasury, and burial chamber, were more than 5,000 individual objects, a number so vast that it took Carter and his team a full 10 years to catalogue, photograph, conserve, and remove them all, from 1,922 to 1,932. The work was painstaking. Carter employed photographer Harry Burton from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, whose meticulous black and white photographs of each object in situ remain among the most important archaeological records ever made. Conservator Arthur Mace, also from the Met, helped stabilize fragile objects that had waited 3 millennia to be touched again. The treasury room alone contained some of the most breathtaking artifacts ever recovered from the ancient world, including the magnificent canopic shrine guarded by its 4 golden goddesses and a stunning gilded figure of the jackal-form deity resting atop a portable shrine, wrapped in a linen shirt dated by a hieratic inscription to the 7th year of Akhenaten's reign, a haunting connection to Tutankhamun's father. There were 6 dismantled chariots, their wooden frames overlaid with gold and decorated with scenes of the king hunting and in battle. There were ornate thrones, including the famous golden throne, perhaps the single most beautiful piece of furniture to survive from antiquity, depicting Tutankhamun and Akhetaten in an intimate domestic scene, the queen tenderly anointing her husband with perfumed oil while the rays of the Aten shine down upon them, a detail revealing that this throne was made early in the reign, before the Aten was fully abandoned. There were over 100 baskets and containers of food bread, dried fruits, joints of beef, duck, and goose provisions for the journey through the underworld. There were 36 jars of wine, some still bearing hieratic labels indicating their vintage, vineyard location, and even the name of the chief vintner labels that are, in effect, the oldest surviving wine bottle labels in the world. There were board games, including a beautifully crafted ivory senet set mounted on an ebony stand. The ancient Egyptian game of 30 squares, believed by the New Kingdom period to symbolize the soul's perilous passage through the underworld, a game the dead would play against invisible opponents for the fate of their own soul. There were 413 Shabti figurines, small mummy-form servants carved from wood, stone and faience, one for each day of the year, plus overseers, designed to spring to life and perform manual labor on behalf of the king in the afterlife whenever he was called upon by the gods. There were weapons bows of remarkable craftsmanship, gold-handled daggers, throwing sticks and shields, including one dagger of particular scientific fascination, a blade with a gold hilt and crystal pommel, whose iron blade, when analyzed by researchers using X-ray fluorescence spectrometry in 2016, was confirmed to have been forged from meteoric iron, identifiable by its high nickel and cobalt content. In the Bronze Age, when smelted iron was essentially unknown, meteoric iron metal that had literally fallen from the sky was among the rarest and most precious materials on Earth. The ancient Egyptians called it biz nupta, meaning iron of heaven, and its inclusion in the king's burial speaks to the cosmic significance attached to it. There were model boats, 35 in total miniature vessels, with masts, rigging, and oars, intended to carry the king across the celestial waters of the afterlife and accompany the sun god on his nightly journey through the underworld. There were elaborate gilded wooden statues of the king standing on the back of a leopard and harpooning a hippopotamus, mythological images representing the triumph of order over chaos. Every single object had a purpose. The ancient Egyptians did not bury their dead with treasures for mere display or earthly vanity. They buried them with everything they would need, because they believed, with absolute and unwavering conviction, that death was not an ending but a continuation, that the afterlife was a mirror of earthly life, and that a king would need his chariots, his food, his games, his servants, and his weapons just as surely on the other side as he had needed them in this world. As the Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves has written, Tutankhamun's tomb is less a grave than a warehouse stocked and inventoried for an eternal existence. For over 3,000 years, this extraordinary funeral assemblage sat undisturbed in the darkness beneath the Valley of the Kings. Other royal tombs had been ransacked in antiquity professional tomb robbers, sometimes working in organized gangs with inside knowledge from the very craftsmen who built the tombs, stripped them of gold and precious materials, often within decades of burial. Papyri from the reign of Ramesses IX, known as the tomb robbery papyri, record the trials of thieves caught plundering royal burials and provide vivid confessions of men who melted down golden coffins and divided the spoils. Tutankhamun's tomb was not entirely immune. Evidence shows it was entered at least twice in antiquity, likely within a few years of burial. Items in the antechamber were disturbed. Oils and unguents had been partially stolen from their vessels, and some gold rings were found bundled in a cloth, apparently dropped by a fleeing thief. But the robberies were detected, the tomb was resealed by necropolis officials who left their stamp impressions on the restored doorways, and crucially, the burial chamber itself appears to have been left largely intact. The tomb then survived the centuries, partly because of its small size and low ground-level entrance, partly because debris from the later construction of the tomb of Ramesses VI, KV9, directly above it, buried the doorway beneath tons of limestone chips, rubble, and workers' huts, effectively erasing it from the landscape and from memory. By the time of the Greek and Roman periods, no one knew it was there. It was not until November 4th, 1922, after 6 seasons of increasingly frustrating and expensive excavation in the Valley of the Kings, during which many experts had declared the valley exhausted of discoveries, that a young Egyptian water boy working for the British archaeologist Howard Carter stumbled upon a stone step cut into the bedrock beneath the remains of ancient workers' huts. Carter, a meticulous and self-taught archaeologist who had spent over 30 years working in Egypt, and who had been searching the Valley of the Kings under the financial patronage of George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat and passionate amateur Egyptologist, immediately recognized its significance. He ordered the step cleared and discovered a descending staircase leading to a sealed doorway bearing the jackal and 9 captive seal of the royal necropolis. Carter, in an extraordinary act of discipline that would be nearly unimaginable today, ordered the staircase refilled and sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. 3 weeks later, on November 26th, 1922, with Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, standing behind him in the narrow descending corridor, Carter chiseled a small hole in the upper left corner of the sealed doorway and held up a candle. As the hot air escaping from the chamber caused the flame to flicker, Carter peered inside and saw, by candlelight, a chaotic jumble of golden objects, glinting in the darkness, animal-headed couches, overturned chariots, alabaster vases, strange black shrines, and everywhere the glint of gold. When Lord Carnarvon, unable to bear the suspense, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter reportedly turned and whispered the now immortal words, "Yes, wonderful things." In his later published account, Carter described the moment with more composure but equal awe. "At first I could see nothing, the hot air escaping from the chamber, causing the candle flame to flicker. But presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, the details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold everywhere, the glint of gold." What he was seeing, for the first time in over 3 millennia, was the glittering chaos of a pharaoh's burial piled high with gold, statues, and the material remains of an ancient funeral ceremony frozen in time. It remains the single greatest archaeological discovery ever made. The discovery ignited a global sensation, Tutmania, that swept through the 1920s with a force that rivaled any modern celebrity phenomenon. Egyptian motifs suddenly appeared everywhere, in architecture, fashion, jewelry, cinema, and advertising. The Chrysler Building in New York, designed in 1928, bears Egyptian-influenced ornamentation. Women's fashion embraced Egyptian-style jewelry and clothing. Films about mummies proliferated. And with that sensation came myth. When Lord Carnarvon died on April 5, 1923, just 4 months and 19 days after the tomb's opening, from an infected mosquito bite on his cheek, which he nicked while shaving, leading to erysipelas and then pneumonia, complicated by his already fragile health. Following a severe car accident years earlier, newspapers around the world seized on the story with breathless enthusiasm. The Curse of the Pharaohs was born. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a devoted spiritualist, publicly suggested that the death could have been caused by elementals created by Tutankhamun's priests to guard the tomb. The novelist Marie Corelli claimed to possess an ancient Arabic text warning of dire consequences for those who entered sealed tombs. Headlines screamed that supernatural vengeance was being visited upon those who had dared disturb the king's rest. Every subsequent death among people even remotely connected to the excavation was attributed to the curse, regardless of the actual cause, even though many of those deaths occurred years or decades later and from entirely mundane causes. The truth, as is often the case, was far less dramatic. No curse inscription was ever found inside Tutankhamun's tomb. The so-called curse text, most commonly quoted, "Death shall come on swift wings, to him who disturbs the peace of the king," is a complete fabrication, with no archaeological source whatsoever. Howard Carter himself, the man most guilty of disturbing the burial, lived for another 17 years, dying of lymphoma in his London flat on March 2, 1939, at the age of 64, a date that, with a certain symmetry, falls exactly 87 years ago today. His colleague, Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was among the first to enter the tomb, lived until 1980, reaching the age of 78. A statistical study published in the British Medical Journal in 2002 examined the longevity of those present at the tomb's opening and found no evidence of elevated mortality. The curse was a media invention, a product of 1920s tabloid culture feeding on public fascination with ancient mystery. But it endured in popular imagination because it satisfied something deep in the human psyche, the idea that the dead are not entirely powerless, that sacred boundaries exist, that disturbing the rest of kings carries a price. In the decades since Carter's discovery, Modern science has turned its attention to Tutankhamun's mummy with tools the original excavators could never have imagined. In January 2005, Tutankhamun's mummy was removed from its tomb for the first time since Carter's work and subjected to a comprehensive CT scan, 1,700 cross-sectional images generated in just 15 minutes by a portable Siemens scanner brought to the Valley of the Kings. The scan, supervised by Zahi Hawass, then Secretary-General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, revealed that the young king had suffered a severe compound fracture to his left femur shortly before death. The bone had splintered, and embalming resin had seeped into the wound, indicating the fracture occurred while the king was still alive, or very shortly after death, before mummification. The bone showed no signs of healing, suggesting the injury occurred only days before he died. Was this the result of a chariot accident, a fall during a hunt, a blow delivered by an assassin? The 2005 scan also definitively ruled out the earlier murder theory. The skull fragments found in the 1968 X-ray were determined to be pieces of bone dislodged during the mummification process, not evidence of a fatal blow. The scan further revealed that Tutankhamun suffered from a clubfoot, specifically a condition called Talipes equinovarus in his left foot and Kohler disease, and a vascular necrosis of the second and third metatarsal bones, conditions that would have caused him chronic pain and significant difficulty walking. This detail was poignantly supported by the discovery in his tomb of 130 walking sticks and canes, many showing signs of actual use, not ceremonial objects, but practical aids for a young king who struggled to walk unaided. DNA analysis, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in February 2010 by Hawass and an international team, added another devastating layer to the story. Tutankhamun carried multiple strains of the malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal form of the disease, which was endemic in the Nile Valley. Combined with the genetic consequences of his parents' incestuous union, including bone disease, possible hormonal abnormalities, and a weakened immune system, the emerging picture was of a young man already gravely compromised, for whom a broken leg, complicated by malaria and possible infection, may have been the final fatal combination. Science could not provide a single definitive cause of death, but it could reconstruct the fragility of the boy behind the golden mask, and in doing so, it illuminated the funeral rituals with new poignancy. The embalmers who wrapped his broken body, the priests who performed the opening of the mouth over his golden face, the officials who dragged his coffin across the Nile in solemn procession, they were burying not a mighty warrior king, riding gloriously into the afterlife, but a frail, limping, disease-ridden teenager who had spent his short life in pain, propped up by walking sticks and surrounded by men who may have been more interested in his throne than in his well-being. His treasures, once housed for decades in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square, Cairo, where the golden mask drew millions of visitors and became the single most famous object in Egypt, are now being transferred to the Grand Egyptian Museum at Giza, a monumental new facility near the pyramids that will display the complete Tutankhamun collection together for the first time, allowing visitors to witness the material evidence of that ancient funeral with their own eyes and in its full, overwhelming totality. What makes the funeral of Tutankhamun so profoundly important is not merely its beauty, its gold, or its fame. It is the completeness of the record it provides. Because tomb robbers never stripped it bare, because the rubble from Ramesses VI's tomb sealed it away, because the dry air of the valley preserved organic materials that would have rotted in any wetter climate, and because Howard Carter was meticulous enough to spend a decade documenting every object in its exact position before removing it, hiring Burton to photograph, Mace to conserve, and a team of specialists to record, we possess something that exists for no other pharaoh in history. A virtually intact royal burial from the height of the New Kingdom, the golden age of ancient Egypt. Every other great king's funeral, Ramesses II, Thutmose III, Hatshepsut, Amenhotep III, can only be imagined from fragments and ruins. From empty sarcophagi and stripped walls and scattered Shabti figurines sold on the antiquities market. Tutankhamun's can be reconstructed almost in its entirety, object by object, layer by layer, ritual by ritual. The nested shrines tell us about the architecture of royal burial and the theology of protection. The amulets tell us about protective magic and the geography of the body as sacred landscape. The food and wine jars, with their dated labels, tell us about provisioning the dead and the agricultural economy of the Nile Delta. The wall paintings, though only 4 walls were decorated, tell us about the ceremonies performed at the tomb entrance and the king's journey into the afterlife. The political imagery of Ai performing the opening of the mouth while already wearing the pharaoh's crown tells us about the power struggles that erupted the instant a king stopped breathing. Even the damage caused by ancient robbers tells us about the vulnerabilities of the necropolis system and the eternal tension between sacred duty and human greed. The Egyptologist T.G.H. James of the British Museum once observed that the tomb of Tutankhamun has told us more about the burial customs of the New Kingdom than all other sources combined. In a very real sense, because his tomb was untouched, because his funeral was sealed in darkness and silence for 32 centuries, we are the first people in 3,000 years to witness a royal Egyptian funeral, not as mythology, not as scholarly speculation, not as romantic fantasy, but as physical, tangible, golden reality. And it belonged to a boy who never expected to be remembered at all. And so, the golden doors of Tutankhamun's tomb close once more, sealing not just a pharaoh, but a legend. From the whispers of 1323 before the Common Era to the discovery by Howard Carter in 1922, the boy king continues to speak across millennia, his story shimmering beneath the dust of time. As Carter himself once said, "Yes, wonderful things." Words that still echo through history, capturing the wonder and mystery of Egypt's eternal spirit. Thank you for joining us inside the funeral of Tutankhamun, where death was not an end, but a magnificent beginning. Until next time, may your journey through history be as timeless as the pharaoh's own voyage to eternity.